So welcome to episode 50. This time around, hopefully it works. Just now I saw that Tricia's camera was working. So today I'm delighted to have Dr. Tricia Yeoh from IDEAS Malaysia. She's the CEO of the Malaysian NGO that works on democratic advancement and economic development in Malaysia. Okay, thank you so much, Tricia, for being here. So let's start. I think the question on everyone's mind is, who do you think will be the Prime Minister of Malaysia?
Who do I think will be the Prime Minister of Malaysia? Okay, well, first of all, thank you, Walid, again for having me today, and really apologize for all the technical difficulties of earlier. It's my first time doing an Instagram Live. I had problems with my phone settings and so on. Well, Prime Minister. So let's kind of broaden out a little bit, right, to the GE15. We are talking about the most hotly contested election I can't even remember the last time that there was such a close fight. This is an election where there is going to be a really unpredictable outcome because of various factors. Number one, we're looking at a very large number of new voters whose vote we have never really tracked and traced in the past, 5.8 to 6 million new voters. We're also looking at an election that has possibly a very low voter turnout because of various factors combined. COVID, the floods, the rainfall has been really heavy all across the country. Already some parts are affected by the flood. And of course, the factor which I think we need to spend more time unpacking is the fact that there are all these multiple coalitions, and how the coalitions are going to negotiate after the election itself is really anyone's guess how the particular equations are going to be formed. So going back to the question of who is going to be the Prime Minister, I mean, ultimately it's about which coalition it is that will be the closest to the winning margin. So for those who are uninitiated, we have 222 parliamentary seats. So therefore a simple majority would ensure any party that has 112 seats and beyond a simple majority in parliament. And in the past, we always would have one of the coalitions being able to go past that simple majority mark. And it was very simple, it was very clear that the leader of that particular party or that particular coalition would therefore form the government, and therefore the leader would be the Prime Minister. But it's not so simple now. I think what we're looking at is that no one coalition will actually win a majority. And in such situations, these coalitions will probably have to negotiate with each other to form a coalition government. And so that's one, meaning that you come together to get the seats to cross that middle mark. And secondly, they would also need to come to terms and negotiate on which Prime Minister it is that they want. So I believe that the kind of Prime Ministerial candidate that is up for negotiation from each of the coalitions will offer, 1 to 2. That will also be actually a point of negotiation. Meaning that if there is another party or another coalition that cannot agree on that particular coalition's offering as a prime ministerial candidate, then it could possibly be that the coalition itself cannot be formed. So there cannot be an understanding or an agreement between them. So it really is tricky, right? You can't just say that, okay, in the past you have Barisan Nasional, this is the prime minister's candidate. Pakatan Harapan, this is the prime minister's candidate. Now I would say that even the prime minister candidate is something that will be a point of negotiation.
Right. Yeah. So you think that is true even for PN and PH? So that's true for Barisan, right? Likely because Zahid seems like he. But what about Pakatan Harapan and Perikatan Nasional?
So okay, so I think if you want to talk about like actual names, you have like 5 possible names who would be up for being prime minister. So you have Anwar Ibrahim, who would be the prime minister if Pakatan Harapan wins or it can negotiate with another coalition. You have Mahathir, Dr. Mahathir, who is now leading Pejuang. You have Muhyiddin, who is leading Bersatu under Perikatan Nasional. And then you have the two from Barisan Nasional, right? Ismail Sabri and Zahid. So bear in mind that all these 5 individuals have either been prime ministers or deputy prime ministers in the past. So obviously there is that yearning for coming back, right, into some form or shape of power. So I think we have these 5 individuals, and these are the 5 names that have been touted. However, I think that one really needs to be circumspect and be prepared for any other possible livelihoods as well. So, for example, you know, I think no one's really raised this question, at least publicly. Maybe I haven't followed every conversation yet, but Ismail Sabri's seat is actually very thin, marginal seat. If I'm not mistaken, his last, the seat where he's contesting the majority vote was quite slim at about 2,000, and Zahid Hamidi's seat is a bigger majority, but he has actually also proven to become rather an unpopular figure of late. Many of the surveys are showing that he is declining in popularity.
You're talking about Zahid, right? Not Ismail, right? You're talking about Zahid.
Sorry, can you repeat that?
You are talking about Zahid, right? Not Ismail.
No, I talked about both Ismail and Zahid. So I said
both of them you think are
Ismail's
becoming unpopular?
Zahid becoming unpopular.
Right.
Yeah, Zahid becoming unpopular, not Ismail.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
So what about for Pakatan Harapan? Is Anwar Ibrahim in any danger? So let's say Pakatan wins, but Anwar doesn't win his seat. Is that a possibility at all?
I think that's. So you're asking 2 questions, right? So one is like if Pakatan wins. So of course we don't know. I think at the moment the projections still put them at about 80 to 90 seats at most. That's like in a very very like positive scenario for Pakatan Harapan. There have been some figures that were thrown about Pakatan actually winning more than 100 seats, but I don't think that's possible. I think if you look at the projections, there are very, very secure, like 55 seats, and then between 55 and 80 to 90, like that's possible, but that's also positive. But going to the question of whether Anwar himself could potentially lose, I mean, I think the fact that he's going to a pretty risky place in Perak, which has always been a tricky state because it has swung both sides in the past. It's gone from one coalition to the other in multiple number of years and elections. So the seat that he's contesting, Tambun, is not necessarily a secure seat for him. I think it would be, he will also be up against the incumbent, who is currently the caretaker Minister of Youth and Sports. And there will be, other candidates as well. So I think just a short answer to your question is that, is there a chance that he doesn't win? Yes, there is a chance that he doesn't win as well. So these 5 names that I've just put out, I think it's really important to consider the likelihood of none of the 5 that have been speculated as the next prime minister to actually be even close to being in the running, which therefore leaves us with other names. And we know that there are other names which perhaps are not in the front line, but the sort of second in line. For instance, there is Tok Mat, who is from UMNO, and he's been given a very safe seat in Rembau, which was Khairi Jamaluddin's former seat, which he had to give up. So if that is to happen, that's another name that I think people should not forget either.
Wow. So what about on the PH side? Do you think there is another name? I'm looking for a scoop today, so is there anything that anything that from the insider's perspective or what you have heard on the grapevine?
You mean any other possibility of a prime minister candidate coming from PH?
Because some people have talked about the Anwar being moved to Tambun. It's kind of a strange move, and is that because of internal politicking, and is that because people within Pakatan and PKR especially are a bit tired of him, and it's a move to get rid of him, and therefore, is there somebody else waiting? Is there a possible prime ministerial candidate from PH?
I mean, I think what you're trying to get me to say is to bring up the possible Rafizi factor.
I didn't mention him, but
okay, so I think I will say as much as this, right? I will say that Rafizi coming back in the fray is a good thing. I think it gives some extra energy and life and rejuvenation to the party, which really sorely needs it. I think as far as the sort of disagreements and tensions that exist between him and Anwar, I mean, look, every party has people who agree and disagree with each other. I'm sure that somewhere along the way, they still needed to align between themselves as far as the strategy is concerned. Anwar's decision to go to Tambun in Perak should not be, I don't think, seen as a sort of sacrificial position. If anything, it was really, if I understand correctly, and this has been an opposition strategy from before as well, where they take, secure names, popular big names, and put them in states that they really want to contest and win over. So they did this in Johor, when they tried to get Johor back, or not back, but actually like win over Johor as a state in 2018, and they won, right? Like they actually took the entire state government as well. I mean, yes, it fell later on during the Sheraton move, but the fact is that that they have tried very hard to make that their strategy. So going in a very concerted manner to a particular state that may actually be hostile. In the case of Perak, it's not an entirely hostile state. I mean, DAP does have a pretty stronghold in Perak. I think they have some DAP stalwarts there, in the form of people like Nga Komeng. These are people who have been in Perak for a long time. So DAP does have a foothold there. But like I said, it's been a swing state, so I think they really wanted to. And also bear in mind that Perak is only one. It's one of the 3 states that will be contested in this election, whereas the other states will be waiting for next year. So if it's any of the states that Pakatan really wants to go in big this time, it would be Perak. But I must say that the kind of national conversation and narrative about Perak has died down quite a lot in the last week, in light of other contests taking place in what the media believes to be more hotly contested seats, such as in Kuala Selangor and Sungai Buloh.
Right. Exactly. So, Lim Kit Siang also moved, to Johor, and that was part of the strategy that you were talking about. So let's talk a little about Anwar Ibrahim, right? So, I think in any other country, right, if a leader has consistently failed to win in multiple elections, that person wouldn't be the leader of the opposition anymore, right? In UK, 1 election you do not win, or maximum 2 elections you're out as the leader of the opposition, right? So, but Anwar has a very long shelf life, right? Why is that? And do you think that actually harms the opposition just as much as the presence of people like Zahid and the old guard harms Barisan National? Does the presence of the old guard in Pakatan Harapan, specifically Anwar, does it harm the opposition, you think?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the question is about renewal and rejuvenation within the party, right? In any other country, I think you're right that, so for example, in this election, Anwar were to lose his seat in Tambun, if there are certain key parliamentary seats in the stronghold of the opposition, such as within Selangor or even Penang, that are lost by Pakatan, then, and the standing of Pakatan therefore falls, then I think it is really time. In fact, it's past time, according to some people, that there needs to be that sense of leadership renewal from within Pakatan Harapan. So your question about equating the old guard within Barisan UMNO and Anwar Ibrahim in Pakatan, like whether that's the same equivalence, right? Can we draw an equivalence there? For Barisan and UMNO, I think that it's not just about the old guard in UMNO. I think it's also about what they represent, right? So if the old guard of any party represents a kind of culture that is unwilling to accept new ways or bringing up young blood within the party, then I would say they do need to think about stepping aside. However, there also can be, members of the old guard. I mean, I don't want to be ageist here as well. If you're a member of the old guard who actually believes that, yes, there should be renewal and makes way for that and really takes active steps to ensure that young people are recruited, are given the right opportunities to not just join, but, climb up the ranks, then I think that's probably less of a problem. And I think an additional problem about why people think about old guard in UMNO as problematic is because many of them are associated with old cultural political patronage practices within UMNO, including some of whom, being involved actively in the 1MDB related cases. So I think those things are probably conflated in people's minds, but I think it's a right thing to be able to unpack them, right? Like what's the reason that we are not supportive of the old guard? If the old guard can make way and are actively encouraging others to do so, I don't see any reason why, they should step aside necessarily. So that question would apply to any party. I mean, I would say the same thing for Pakatan Harapan as well. But I mean, whatever it is, young leaders do need to rise. So yeah, I think, this election result will also tell us the direction to which, the party needs to take.
Right. So just one final one on this particular point. So you think that if Pakatan Harapan doesn't manage to form a simple majority, either by a coalition or whatever it is, Anwar should step aside. But do you think that will happen? I don't see a universe in which he willingly steps aside, right?
I think this is a problem of I think it's not just, Malaysia. I think many Southeast Asian or Asian countries for that matter, and not just restricted to political parties, mind you. This is also something that applies to non-profit organizations, charities alike. Succession planning is just not done very well, just because we like our leaders, we like our hierarchies, we actually pay allegiance and we give credence, right, to the leaders and the age-old ones as well. Will he step aside? I think he has not. I think the answer to that is that he has not cultivated sufficient leaders who are able to immediately take over the reins. And many people have also fallen away, right? So unfortunately, over the years of the whole Reformasi movement within Parti Keadilan itself, there have been many opportunities to create, new leaders or new presidents in waiting, so to speak. Yeah, again, in an Asian society, I think the leader at the very top needs to make that decision, and it's only his that can be made, meaning that he steps aside so that the younger ones and the younger blood can come up. I mean, in Parti Keadilan itself, there are scores of younger leaders. So you're talking about leaders in their 30s, 40s, who have come up through the Reformasi years and over the last 20 years, right, starting from 2008. So there is a stock of leadership there. But what's lacking would be the leaders in between. So you actually have a gap between the likes and the generation of Anwar Ibrahim and then the generation in their 30s and 40s. And can Malaysians accept a leader who is, age 40 plus? Possibly not yet. but maybe that's something that we need to change the mentality of as well.
Right. I mean, Rishi Sunak is 43, right? And the problem you mentioned, right? I think both all the mainstream parties are beset with this, right? This legacy politics. So you have Hishamuddin Hussein, Najib Tun Razak, Nurul Izzah Anwar, Lim Guan Eng, right? So do you think that's not is that a non-issue? Because if you're good enough, it doesn't matter what your family background is? Or do you think you will inherit a lot of these issues as well that your parents may have had, and it's not healthy ultimately for Malaysian politics?
I think legacy politics is all around the world. I don't think it's exceptional to us. I mean, we might, in Asia, might seem to be more apparent. Definitely in countries like India, Pakistan, Southeast Asia alike, this happens, right? I mean, it happens in Singapore too. So what more in a Malaysian culture and society that's like a lot more hierarchical, as I talked about earlier. And it also happens in other countries, right? Sons, leaders of presidents. In Southeast Asia is quite notorious for that, right? So you just think about, Bongbong Marcos, think about Indonesia as well.
Megawati.
Yeah, Megawati. So is it a good or a bad thing? I think it's really up to each candidate to be able to prove their worth. As voters, we should not support a candidate just on the back of that person being part of a famous family, tried, true, and tested. I think we need to be able to make those judgments for ourselves. And let's take Malaysia and Nurul Izzah, for example. I think she is somebody who actually has proved her worth. Some people are not entirely satisfied with her performance as a member of parliament, but she's someone who is able to stand her ground, right? I mean, she can speak to an international audience. She has delivered, addresses at very, very high level United Nations type places. She's also able to interact with people on the ground in the kampong. She has, good policy ideas. She's launched something on the multidimensional index on poverty. And I think sometimes the pressures that we place on daughters and sons of politicians is quite high. And in Izzah's case, I think she actually did try very much to separate her identity very clearly from that of her father's. And in her case, I would say that she is quite deserving to be a leader in her own right. I think there's no right or wrong answer to this. Really, I think the question is, given that it is such a phenomenon in Asia, how do we, make the most of it? How do voters actually, try to make sense more independently of each candidate's potential and worth? Would they be able to, come up with good policy ideas? Will they engage on policy debates, the ones that matter to us? Will they declare their assets? Will they also, this one would be interesting, right? Like, will they be able to take positions that diametrically also oppose their parents, their fathers, on the right things? So I think that would be like a true test. And, there's some comments here about some of the people who are, being set out these elections. We don't know what the internal decisions have been within the party. But yeah, I think if that particular reference is to DAP, I think that the party has, of course, legacy issues as well. You mentioned that Lim Kit Siang, Lim Guan Eng. But the good thing is that they've also given way to somebody else, right, to be the Secretary General. And I think he's also been able to make some decisions which are slightly different. You may consider them to be like subtle differences, but I think the types of people who are now in that party, also in UMNO. So let's also talk about, so this theme of renewal, versus legacy. I think UMNO as a party is also very interesting. I mean, I think that they're also going through their own, whatever transformation out of necessity process following 2018. Yeah, you don't lose an election without having to ask yourself some really hard questions and looking at themselves in the mirror. And from what I have also heard, that there were a lot of challenging usul. Like usul would be kind of questions that come from the ground, from the cabang, from the cawangan, right? The branches,
the branches.
What do you call that in English now?
Branch.
Yeah. So the party branches, right? So the party branches themselves have also placed pressure upwards to the leadership, and so when that happens, then parties may also need to think about renewal from the top if the pressures are coming from the bottom. So I think this generation of politicians is really interesting to look at, the newer politicians who may not be stuck in their old ways from the past. They might be more willing to engage. The term of the day, is bipartisanship or multi-partisanship. It's also the thing that got the MOU across the table, some of the bills, the anti-hopping law, the Undi 18, lowering of the voting age to 18. I mean, some of these things would never have happened were there not a bipartisan approach. Sure. And so the younger leadership, I think, is much more open to this than the older guard. And I think the pressures are coming from all around, right? Top, bottom, left, right, center. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Thank you so much. Yeah, I think that was a comprehensive answer, and I agree with you. I think each candidate should be judged by their own merits. Nurul Eza is an outstanding candidate for sure. And I just wanted to ask about Pakatan Harapan. And do you think that the parties in the coalition, right? So PKR, DAP, not so much Amanah because it is new, but still it's a splinter party from past. Do you think they all took a hit in their credibility when they decided to make Dr. Mahathir the prime ministerial candidate? And it seemed to me that all along, I mean, PKR was essentially a party founded on justice against Dr. Mahathir, right? And DAP has had a lot of issues with Dr. Mahathir before. So it seems like they lost the moral ground when they decided to do that. And they showed that, politics is ultimately about expediency, and no party should be talking about morality, it seems to me. Will you say that's a fair assessment?
Yeah, I mean, this is a tricky one. Okay, look, all parties exist to be in a position of power. Only in highly exceptional cases would the party exist for platforming purposes, right? To raise and champion issues. And you could say that for very few parties in Malaysia, such as Parti Socialist Malaysia, to a certain extent Parti Rakyat Malaysia, which is all but non-existent. Parti Socialist Malaysia has been able to stay on for so long because of only one individual, right? Dr. Jayakumar, who has done an excellent job in doing groundwork, community work. He's provided a lot of medical provisions to his people. But ideologically speaking, it's not a party that all Malaysians can accept. It's a very niche party, not a catch-all party at all. So with that exception being the case, all parties are in there. They're contesting because they want to be in power. I would add that in a country as centralized like Malaysia, in a political system like Malaysia, where all the losers lose all, or rather it's a winner takes all kind of system, the stakes are even higher because the way that resources are distributed, the way money is allocated, constituency development funds, for example, are only rewarded in equal amount. If you are a party aligned with the government, if you're an opposition party, then you don't actually get those resources on an equal share. So it's really not a very level playing field at all in Malaysia, where, like I said, the winner really takes all, the loser also loses all. So with that caveat aside, why would any party decide on a strategy that does not provide them the highest winning odds? I think that really is the question, right? But yes, I agree that parties also need to decide what is the limit, because voters will also make their decisions based on the sort of moral compass that they purport to adhere to. So I think in Keadilan's case, or in Pakatan Harapan's case, what happened in the lead up to 2018, so if you're talking about 2018 as the decision, right, so you're saying that there was a possible compromise in allowing Mahathir to be the Prime Minister, right? That's what you're saying.
Right.
You have to remember that in the 2 years leading up to 2018, there were a lot of incidents that took place in which Mahathir actually demonstrated a level of, you say that, people don't change, and especially someone who is a 90-year-old man, how is it possible that he actually would have changed his colors after so many years of playing the game? But in the few years leading up to 2018, he managed to garner a lot of public support. He attended Bersih 5. He had a lot of public support. Even before the formation of his party Bersatu, he already came up with this sort of like document together with civil society that talked about reforms and the institutional reforms that are needed to address the issue of corruption in Malaysia. He worked closely with some of the major civil society leaders in the country to do that. So what I'm saying is that he was already warming, and some members of society were already warming to him. In fact, it was probably, Parti Keadilan and Anwar that was among the last of these reformist types who were willing to eventually accept him as genuine. By that time, Mahathir was clever enough, strategic enough, wily enough, perhaps you might argue, to be able to win people over. So by the time that he was eventually selected as the Prime Minister candidate, I think it was a compromise. Yes, it was a compromise, but it was a compromise not entirely based on the figurehead of the Mahathir who had imprisoned many people under Operasi Lalang. I think it was a different kind of Mahathir that at least the Pakatan and the supporters of Pakatan had included into their fray and accepted as one of their own. And also because, remember again, it was centralized around the big issue of 1MDB, right? 2018 election was all about 1MDB. They joined forces to fight that. And so I think we have to just remember the context within which many of these things took place. Of course, what happened consequently and his decision or inability to think of handing over the reins to anybody else, that I think singularly was his downfall. But apart from that, I actually don't see it directly as a break in the sort of ideals of Pakatan, because Mahathir had, whatever you might want to think, perhaps it was disingenuous, but he had sufficiently convinced enough people that he too was a reformist. So that was the context, right? Yeah.
Did he convince people he was a reformist, or what did he convince people, and I think he was genuine as in terms of his opposition to Najib and against 1MDB, but he has always been upfront about being a Malay nationalist, right? So, and that seems, so my point is that, right, the ideological differences, and some ideological differences are reconcilable and others are not, right? And it seems to me what DAP and PKR stood for were definitely not reconcilable with what Mahathir stood for as a person. And did Mahathir change? I don't think Mahathir changed, right? I mean, one could say that it was DAP and PKR that momentarily made that decision, or they momentarily changed in when they decided to have him as a prime ministerial candidate.
Yeah, so you're right. I think not enough discussion was done over the ideological position of inclusiveness, and the discussion at the time was really about corruption, about institutional reforms. There was very little discussion about, you know, the ethno-religious question of Malaysia's makeup. In fact, you know, when Bersatu was formed, I think, yes, there were some criticisms about why Bersatu was formed as such a Malay Muslim-centric or solitary Malay Muslim party. But there was not real conversation about the discrepancies in ideology between Bersatu and PKR-DAP, because the conversation at that time was about 1MDB and about corruption. And I think it was felt that that was a priority at that moment. Even after 2018, right? Like if you see the first 100 days, the kind of things that Pakatan came up with, they launched their National Anti-Corruption Plan, NACP, very ambitious, actually very, very good document until today. But they never really quite addressed the issue of ethno-religious ideology. And I think that was probably the stumbling block, that was the Achilles heel of Pakatan Harapan, because short several months after, if you recall, there was this big anti-ICERT rally that took place on the streets of KL, possibly even bigger than any of the birthday rallies that took place prior. And yes, one could say that that was at the agitation of UMNO and PAS combined, because remember, UMNO and PAS also joined forces to form Muafakat Nasional after 2018. And that probably spelled the downfall. So not enough time, not enough consideration was spent on really deliberating these issues out, and which is a real pity, right? Because you're right. I mean, this is something that Anwar himself has championed all this time. But I think it just goes to show you how many issues and challenges continue to face, you know, that Malaysia continues to face all of these things, because as a society, we have not really even been able to segregate and be able to rationally discuss these and come to an agreement of what is the kind of social fabric we want for the country moving forward. I mean, we try to do that at IDEAS, and we try to stimulate these dialogues between different communities, and there are vast differences between the way people want to see their future Malaysia, but we need to be able to create even more safe spaces to have these discussions, because the failure of having these safe spaces would result in what you see, where very easily one party or one race is pitted against the other, and that's not healthy for the long run of any society, especially a country that is so, you know, multi-ethnic, multi-religious, deeply integrated as ours. So I really do hope that whichever new government is formed, we would be able to have those conversations in a real way, and you know, really address even some of the sore points and some of the real grievances that communities have, because we just cannot sweep things under the rug anymore. We need to be able to talk about them rationally, and I think that compromises can be found, and compromise itself should not be considered a dirty word. I think in a country that is polarized, that has very, very many multiple fault lines, it's okay to negotiate, and it's okay to, it's okay necessary to compromise. It's not as if you're giving up your ideals. Your ideals still exist, but how? The real question is, how are you going to live in a common society in the same space with people who have like completely opposing views to yours? Like, that's the real question. Can that happen?
Right. Absolutely, 100% agree. So and on that note, right? So do you think racial politics or the politics of race, that will be the ultimate determinant in this election? It wasn't in 2018. Do you think it will be this time round?
I think the politics of race, I think, again, like people sort of set that aside a little bit in 2018 because 1MDB was the issue, but not entirely, right? Because
correct.
Also, you know, they said that if Mahathir wasn't around in, and if Bersatu wasn't around as part of the coalition in PH in 2018, then PH would never have won, right? They would never have formed federal government in the first place.
Yeah.
Racial politics, yes, to a certain extent. I think it's here to stay. It will be, you cannot avoid it. The paintbrush of race is everywhere. In Malaysia, it colors everything. It colors the way all political parties are campaigning, how they're doing their strategizing, their messaging, their analysis even. But I think that's not enough. So I think any, you know, more sophisticated like analysts has to take that into consideration, but it's not the end all and be all factor. Because if it were, then what accounts for the differences in the ways in which voters are choosing between Barisan Nasional, Perikatan Nasional,
right,
and Pejuang? Right?
Right.
You have like 3 very Malay Muslim parties. All of them stand for Malay Muslim unity. They are all, you know, rather conservative to a certain extent. And there are very clear differences in the way that voters are going to choose for these 3 different parties. And so I think being able to separate between the preferences here is very difficult though. I mean,
right,
it requires like a more layered understanding of Malay society, which I think is also a good thing because Malay society cannot be viewed as being homogeneous either. I think sometimes there's an assumption, especially from non-Malays, right, to just say, okay, you know, who are the Malay voters? Like, what do the Malay voters want? Look, the Malay voters are as human as any of us. We have multiple preferences, and I think, you know, researchers also need to be able to appreciate the subtle differences between the different communities and be able to segment them according to the more psychographic ways, you know, ways in which that companies and marketers have done for time immemorial. And then we'll really be able to understand like what is the pulse and the heart and the beating heart of the Malay community. There's urban, rural. I mean, it's not just urban, rural, but it's about languages. And don't forget like urbanization plus media, exposure to different culture. I think this is also transforming the way in which we are thinking and voting in the present and future.
There's a question here by Chun Hao. So is it possible for race-based politics to transform into class-based politics in the future? I mean, it's not an either or, of course, but more of class-based rather than race-based politics. Do you think it's possible? In the near future, at least?
Yeah, I think we do need to think about class. That's unavoidable. I mean, so most of the surveys and the opinion polls that you see will sort of use like urban and rural as a sort of proxy for class. I mean, that's not actually very accurate, but it is a proxy in a way. And so, yes, analysts will also look at, you know, what's the difference between the urban and the rural vote, assuming that the rural vote, you know, requires there's a certain set of needs from among the rural vote versus among the urban vote. I mean, we need to be able to like do cross-cutting analysis, right? So it's about race, it's about class, it's about you know, like I use this term psychographic. It's what the marketing people use because it segments not just by so age as well, right? Age and then also language. So it's not just enough to talk about race, but it's about what language they speak. So in the commercial world, for example, they will find that the English-speaking Malays and the English-speaking Chinese within a certain geographic region actually share a lot more in common with each other than, for example, the Malay-speaking Malay and the English-speaking Malay, or the Chinese-speaking Chinese and the English-speaking Chinese. So all that to say that, for example, like myself, who I would consider myself an English-speaking Chinese, I don't speak Chinese per se, I have a lot more in common, and my voting trends, my voting patterns would be much more similar to my colleague who's English-speaking Malay compared to a Chinese-speaking Chinese. So I think it's true that race analysis can be rather sweeping, and it doesn't give you that layered approach. So language is important, language, race, class, not just class, but specifically income levels, a level of education, age. All these are multiple factors that one would need to consider. So I think people do tend to be quite superficial when we just talk about race as a single factor.
Right. Thank you so much. So just two more questions, if you could indulge me, right? So one, do you think young voters will turn up?
It's really hard to tell. If you look at the Johor and Malacca state elections, the young voters did not really turn out to vote. And then, of course, people also used Malacca and Johor as a use that as a trajectory to an extension to how they analyze the GE, but that's not accurate either, right? Because GE is very different from state elections. It's really hard to say. I mean, honestly, we just don't know. If you look at, there was a poll that was done by IDEAS Singapore, Institute of Southeast Asian Studies. I think there was a poll specifically done on young voters. And in that survey, quite interestingly, this was done by James Chai. It showed that most young voters actually believe that it is their responsibility to vote, which is really interesting. The common thing that people would say is that they're not educated enough, we have not done enough political education in schools and in public. But the response seemed to be, well, I mean, it was a welcome surprise to know that young people actually do take it upon themselves, and that they do see that their role is important to vote. In the Klang Valley, I mean, again, this is just based on anecdotal evidence. I do believe that most young voters will turn up to vote. They may not actually know who to vote for yet, right? So I think the initial polls also showed that as high as 33% of first-time voters still did not know who to vote for. But the fact that they will vote, I think that's a positive sign. For the rest of Malaysia outside of the Klang Valley, I really don't know. I don't have an answer to that question, whether or not they will turn out to vote. But whatever it is, the voter turnout in this 2022 election will be much lower than the 2018 election, just because of the sheer size and number of new voters coming in. So I think we shouldn't be surprised if we have a 75% voter turnout. I think we should be happy with that already. Yeah.
Right. So, and a lower voter turnout would benefit PN and BN more than it does PH, right?
Yeah, I think assuming that the trends hold from the last state elections, and also the trends from previous elections, assuming those trends hold, yes, low voter turnout tends to benefit the incumbent, which in this case would be like PN/BN.
Right. Okay. So any predictions, Tricia?
Predictions. I think if people have heard this far into the session, they would kind of know what I'm trying to say, which is that no single coalition is going to win. They will have to negotiate with each other. If I had to stick my neck out to make a prediction, I would say that it would still be in the form of some BN plus PN plus GPS in Sarawak plus GRS in Sabah. And that would be a possible outcome to see. And if it's not that, then the other best case scenario would be that it would be another form of an MOU government, the way that we have seen under Ismail Sabri. So Ismail Sabri successfully managed to maneuver this MOU where the opposition supported it, but they did not want to call themselves as being part of the coalition government. So I think that's another possible, outcome as well. If they are not able to form a majority with the coalitions that have traditionally cooperated with BN.
Right. Okay. So no Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim again. So one final question. Let's move into fantasy world, right? If you could choose one person to be the Prime Minister of Malaysia, right? So from any party, forget about the electoral politics, but just one person, who would you want it to be and why?
One person.
One person.
To what? To be the Prime Minister?
Yes.
Okay, you're putting me on the spot here. So regardless of party, coalition.
Yes, yeah.
Let me think about it. Well, obviously I've indulged myself so much in political analysis that I've not indulged my own personal opinions. The right Prime Minister for Malaysia should be the Prime Minister who doesn't want it. I mean, I think if you look at the past, right, I think Dr. Ismail famously called himself a reluctant politician, and they are the ones who actually served the nation best because they were not self-serving. So honestly, I don't have an answer to that question, but I will say this. I think that whichever Prime Minister we do have needs to learn from previous Prime Ministers. IDEAS itself is formed on the back of the vision of Tunku Abdul Rahman. And I know Tunku Abdul Rahman, as the first Prime Minister of Malaysia, had his own faults as well. But there's just so much to learn from the kind of service and humility that he provided to the nation when the nation was just in its fledgling stage. So much humility and sacrifice given. And I think those sorts of values have been lost over time, just because of the way the system has shaped itself out to be. Political corruption, patronage, and so on have really exacerbated over time. So I hope that, I think, it would, in my mind, if you were to ask me, it would be like the restoration of some sort of person who had a similar value system, the likes of the Tunku. And I think that, would be what I would leave you with. Sorry, I don't have the answer that you wanted.
That's a very eloquent cop-out, but I'll let you go. But thank you so much. That was really a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much. So many insights. And I really wish you and Malaysia all the best. No, thank you. Thank you for being here. Okay, goodbye.